Hi, this is Elizabeth Berg, author of The Story of Arthur Truelove, and you're listening to the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast. I'm Nate Goss, and today on the podcast, we welcome comics writer Mark Russell, author of God is Disappointed in You, Prez, Corndog in Chief, and the comic series we spent most of the time talking about, The Flintstones. And I know what you're thinking, those Flintstones, like the Fred, Barney, Bam Bam, modern Stone Age family Flintstones? And I'm actually talking about those very Flintstones. Mark Russell's 2 volumes are part of DC Comics' Hanna-Barbera reboots that pretty much just take the same TV characters and give them brand new updated storylines with a more teen-plus kind of edge. And there's a lot of different ways that you could take that type of project if you were assigned it. Our guest, Mark, decided to use Bedrock and the Flintstones family to create some of the most timely, biting, and insightful satire I frankly have ever read. So don't let the franchise fool you. This has everything you want in a good reading experience, I think. It's quick, fun, smart, and eye-opening all at the same time. So the second and last volume of The Flintstones came out just last October, and I guarantee that it will be appearing in our upcoming favorite fiction of 2017 booklets, which is why I was really excited to actually have Mark be able to be on the podcast to chat with us a little bit about what it was like to make The Flintstones, and we get into some of the deeper topics of being a human being as well. He's always a deep thinker. So please enjoy this interview with Mark Russell. So Mark Russell, welcome to the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast.
Thank you.
So I've asked you to come on because I'm a huge fan of your Flintstones work as part of the DC Comics Hanna-Barbera reimaginings. But I kind of thought we're going to get some confused looks when they keep seeing the Flintstones comic as part of sort of our favorite books of the year roundup. So let's start there. These Hanna-Barbera reboots are kind of essentially the same TV cartoon characters that we've all grown up with, but reimagined through a more, I guess you'd call it maybe a teen-plus lens. And that's really oversimplifying what you've done with the Flintstones. But is it fair to say that that's the concept behind this?
Yeah, I think what I like to do is when I'm writing something to not connect it to the pop culture that it came from, but to connect it more to the real world. I use the real world analog as a fount of inspiration when writing something. So, for example, for the Flintstones, instead of writing it to be reminiscent of the old Flintstones cartoons, because it takes place in this what is ostensibly the world's first civilization, I wanted to write it more as like a critique of civilization and human beginnings.
I wonder what even your experience prior to this was with the Flintstones, or your feelings about the Flintstones, like what you thought was worth keeping in there, what you really knew that you wanted to do that was different.
Yeah, I don't remember really actually enjoying the Flintstones that much. I remember watching it, but I don't remember actually enjoying it. I think the one thing, though, that I did take away from watching the Flintstones when I was a kid was the animal appliances and how horrifying that would be for a bird to have to like live inside a camera. And then when you press the button, the bird comes out of the camera, chisels on a tablet the picture, and then has to go back in the camera until God knows how long they take before they need another picture.
Yeah.
And so that was one thing that really kind of became a tentpole in my comic book series, is how blithely unaware the humans are of the misery they create for all their animal appliances.
Oh, and it creates some of the most emotional storylines in your comic. You know, you've got this relationship between the vacuum cleaner and the bowling ball. And I remember telling a friend recently that it was just a gut punch to me when I read that storyline. And we were both kind of like, how ridiculous does that sound? Like, you just told me you had a gut punch reading a story about a vacuum cleaner and a bowling ball.
Yes, I feel like my job is done. I made someone react to a vacuum cleaner in an emotional way. But yeah, and I feel like in a lot of ways, it's not just sort of like a critique of people back then or those evil people. It's sort of a critique of the way we all live. I mean, I'm recording this on an iPhone, and we know that at the iPhone factories, there's all kinds of issues where people work under oppressive conditions. And so it's just a reminder that all of our conveniences are kind of built upon this well of human misery. And what do we do about that?
You know, I think one of the unique things about your version of Bedrock is how it actually, in your version, it's a new civilization. Like everything is being discovered for the first time, you know? And I think it's like you're getting to ask the questions that you wish humanity would have asked all along.
Yeah, I wanted to, give them the excuse that we don't have, which is naivete. They're encountering everything for the first time, so of course they're going to make mistakes. Of course they're going to be naive about the power of television or about like electing somebody who makes promises they can't possibly keep. They have that excuse, but I wanted to, in doing so, make people kind of uncomfortable with our own naivete. Well, what's our excuse? We've been at this for a long time, and why are we still making these mistakes?
You use the word naivete. I think that's a really good word. I mean, to me, the absurdity in the world of Bedrock that you show is it's kind of exposed through the Flintstone family's confusion or their sort of innocent questioning. They don't come at things with any sort of defensive posture. You know, I was listening to another interview that you did, and you said that this helps us to envision something better going forward. So what do you think it looks like to be a Flintstone now in this day and age?
That's an interesting question. I think to be a Flintstone, really, we have to start thinking about the things that they take for granted more deeply. So, like, understand what we see as wrong or as funny with their world, and then extrapolate what mistakes are we committing in the same way in our world. And oftentimes they're the same mistakes. They just don't know any better than to put it bluntly. They haven't learned the politeness of disguising their true opinions or disguising their true intents. For example, the newscaster, television is brand new in Bedrock, and so the newscaster will just say things like, "This is the news, where we tell you about things if we have footage of them," which is sort of like what the news is. It's like they only tell you about things if they can make a good television story out of it. They're so new to this, they don't know they need to sort of disguise their shortcomings with euphemism.
More than any other comic I think I've read, I found myself just writing down lines from the Flintstones because I just thought they seemed really insightful and really succinctly put. One example that really hit me in the second volume is Fred's kind of realization that a civilization is going to last. It will only be because we've learned to do one thing, to care for people who mean nothing to us, which I thought was just really something. I've almost had to kind of like sit with that for a few days, like just thinking about what that means in my own life.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty much it. I try to put things as succinctly and as quickly as possible. George Saunders had a great line, which I kind of live by, and he says that that humor is the truth quicker than you expected it, and that's sort of one of my guiding writing philosophies.
Yeah,
it's like, this is as quick as I can put it. Is this as blunt as I can be? And if not, how do I boil it down to like one sentence? And then usually in the Flintstones, there's one sentence, one line, usually delivered by Fred, that kind of encapsulates the entire theme or my entire message with that issue. Boil it down to like one short thing. And I honestly believe to me, that's the real value of civilization, is that we are cared for and we care for others, people that aren't in our family, people that aren't our friends, people that don't have an immediate connection or value to us. We still see the value in making sure that some lonely widow doesn't starve to death, or that somebody who can't afford a full library has a free public library to go to. Without this basic empathy and care, civilization is just a rat race. It's just a competition.
You really aren't shying away from these really big topics. I mean, it's a fairly candid satire. You're commenting pretty directly on, I mean, we can just go down a list: religion, science, economics, media, gender, consumerism, racism, nationalism. I guess I just wanted to ask, like, what made you actually think you could say something about all these things in like 12 issues, or what would be compiled into 2 volumes? Pretty short volumes, actually.
Yeah, well, I wrote a shortened, modernized retelling of the Bible called "God is Disappointed in You."
Yeah.
So I figured once I crossed that Rubicon, there was nothing too out of bounds.
I guess that's true.
I'd already committed the ultimate blasphemy, so I might as well go for broke. Once you set yourself on fire, make sure you just use as much gasoline as you can, because you don't want to have to begin that over. So Yeah, that's kind of, I wrote the Flintstones really kind of the same mindset. Like, this is a manifesto told in humor.
And do you think that the comics format helps you to do that a little bit, like actually pack more in?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's so much that I can do visually that I can't really say with words, or that I don't have to, because Steve Pugh, the artist, is so brilliant at making like great sort of background gags or creating this world landscape behind the characters, that I can just put subtle things in the background that sort of reinforce what I'm saying. Little things like they have to kill off the tree people in order to make bedrock. And then, every now and then you see the middle school in the background with the sign like home of the fighting tree people. I don't really need to go have a whole issue devoted to like the mascots,
right,
the Native American mascots in that one. I can just have something drawn in the background that makes that point for me. Actually,
that I wanted to talk a little bit about your, how you collaborated with Steve Pugh, the illustrator here. Now, had you worked with Steve Pugh before?
No, I never even heard of Steve.
So how do you get paired up with someone like that?
I've worked so far my entire comics career with one editor. I've been very lucky to work with Marie Javins, who's a really experienced and brilliant editor at DC Comics. And she's the one that matches me up with the artists. And so far, she just bats 1,000. I mean, every artist she pairs me up with has been great.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems like a perfect match. I mean, even his interpretation of what the characters look like. You immediately look at the cover, you look through the comic, and you're like, okay, these are the Flintstones we know, but they're very different. So how did you guys come up with that, idea of what would the world look like and the characters, since you're not the one who's actually illustrating the comic itself?
We had some Skype calls back and forth, and I think one of the things that was really kind of instructive to him to let him know exactly the way this world was going to be is like issue number 1, there's a 2-page spread right at the beginning where they introduce Bedrock, and I basically just wrote, what sorts of businesses and buildings are in Bedrock, and a list of like a dozen names of businesses in Bedrock. And I think as soon as he got that, and that was right at the beginning, he got the sort of world that we are creating. It's there's a restaurant called Whammoth Bammoth Thank You Mammoth.
The puns are amazing in this thing, by the way.
A store called Trey's Bird Slavery Emporium.
Yeah.
There's a tar pit instead of a target.
Yep.
And so I think once he got that list, he's like, oh, okay, I see what we're doing. And he's really good at like just creating world building and creating he mostly just created the look. I didn't have to tell him too much. I just basically gave him the tone and like the sort of like flavor of how this comic was going to be. And then he came up with like the looks of the characters and whatnot, or sometimes I'd say somebody is going to be mildly based on Carl Sagan or, based on, and he would just come up with a look for that person. But yeah, I think it helped a lot that he has a very similar sense of humor.
As far as the conceptual design goes, that makes a lot of sense. But, what does this look like in the way it works out with you actually writing? Are you giving him like a script? Are you actually laying out panels for him? or is he sort of deciding how to split this up into panels?
No, I usually write a script splitting up the panels. He could deviate it from if he wants that. Like if I put something in 5 panels, and he's like, oh, I can do this in 4. He's free to do it the way he envisions it.
Okay.
But usually I write a script that divides it up in panels and that tells the artist what's going on in each of the panel, and then I send it to Marie, my editor, who reviews it, see if there's anything problematic in the story or anything that's going to get DC sued. And then if so, she makes me change it, and then sends it, once it's changed and ready to be drawn, she sends it to Steve. And then Steve sends us pencils for review and make sure everything looks right.
When you're giving him your panels, are you writing in them, or do you draw at all? Or
No, I mean, I can draw a little bit. I'm
okay.
Not as good as Steve or any of the other artists I work at DC. But sometimes if I can't explain something quite right, I'll just draw like an example of how I think it should look, and I'll send it to them. But yeah, mostly I just send a written script. And this is one thing I found working there too with such good artists, is that you want to leave as much to their imagination as possible, because they'll usually surprise you with something that's better than what you were envisioning.
Yeah. I bet that's hard to do, though, I would think, kind of like losing a little control.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing I discovered with Steve, too, is that fewer panels are better. It's like I don't want to have a page with like 6 or 7 panels. I want to give them like 3 or 4 panels in a page so we can really develop the background and the world and have pterodactyls flying in the background and volcanoes and stuff. I want to give them as much liberty in filling the blanks as possible with artwork, because it is first and foremost a visual medium.
So let's talk a little bit about the world, actually. In another interview, you said that, and it really struck me, actually. You said, I don't really write about the characters. I more write about the world and let the characters be the lens through which I talk about it, which is kind of what you had said earlier in this interview, actually. I guess I just kind of find that unique, or at least maybe unique for a writer or a creator to admit, because it seems like a very different approach. Can you talk a little bit more about like what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I think what feels real to me when I'm reading about characters is how they react to the world around them. When people just kind of have these sort of internal motivations and they act a certain way, and they've got these clear sort of characteristics, but they don't really engage the world around them. To me, that always feels contrived. To me, it feels like, oh, this person went to an MFA class and learned right there, but has never really experienced anything. I'm very much of the opposite philosophy, where writing is about the world. It's not really about other writing. It's not really about following these literary formulas. It's about like creating realistic characters that react to the world in which they live. And so the reactions all have to kind of be based upon the situation that you put them in. The
Flintstones were so true in their character development. Like the family and the appliances even, they didn't feel like these cold, immutable players in a game world. It seems like it worked out. It's worked out really well.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think also when they are just sort of facets of the world in which they live, the stakes feel higher. I mean, Fred loses his job. The bowling ball gets sent to the recycling center, and all of a sudden, because they're reacting to things going on in the world around them, you feel like they're in actual mortal danger. You feel like these people are reacting the way you would to these situations.
I mean, it seems like so much of the comedy of your Flintstones is that satire, kind of showing humanity as these like overgrown toddlers that need to grow up, before they destroy everything.
Yeah, and that's basically my feeling, my assessment of the human race is that we are kind of, as a species, stuck in our terrible twos. For most of our existence so far, we've been able to just take whatever we want from nature, and it hasn't been a problem because we were so few in number and we were so insignificant on the planet. But now that we actually have the power to deforest whole continents and cause entire species to go extinct, we can't really think like a toddler anymore. We've got to grow up and begin to learn self-control, or we're going to break all our toys.
It's pretty much exactly how you put it in the comic. It's a lot to think about, actually. But the Flintstones as the family, actually Fred, Wilma, Pebbles, they almost seem to represent. Do they kind of represent the exception, or are they just a little bit more mature of 2-year-olds?
I think that in a lot of ways they represent people who are beginning to have this awareness. They're beginning to question what civilization is doing right, and whether or not civilization needs to be more than just a cheap place to get rattlesnake meat.
It seems to me, at least when I was reading it, that your voice often is coming through strongest in Fred, in Wilma, in Pebbles. And I guess I'm wondering why you decided to take the satire in that direction. Like, why to use the whole family as kind of maybe the closest thing to call it is the straight man.
Well, and I think they all experience the world in different ways. I mean, Wilma's an artist, so my opinions about art will come through her. Fred's like a working stiff, so my opinions about the American workplace and economics will come through him. And Pebbles is going through her own world as like a middle schooler, as somebody who's being exposed to like ideas of science and religion and friendship for the first time. She's going to be the natural conduit for my opinions on those things. Like in Dungeons and Dragons, when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, the players themselves view themselves as the sky gods who are creating the fate of these characters they've created. That's kind of the way I approach writing a comic book. I am the sky god, and I'm used to intervene and speak through somebody.
It's a lot of power.
Yeah. No, I get drunk on it.
I wanted to ask you who some of your comedy influences are, or where you got your comedy style from.
I think mostly my sense of humor is probably derived from my mom. I think she's probably the most influential on my overall sensibility. But in terms of writing, like probably everybody else who's my age, I was heavily influenced by Kurt Vonnegut. And I also, not necessarily in a comedy sense, but I was also heavily influenced by Ray Bradbury. Probably the most influential book I ever read was The Martian Chronicles, because it just tells this whole history of basically of us ruining this new virgin planet in these short 2-3 page vignettes. And it's really beautiful. It really convinced me that 2 or 3 pages is about the ideal length of a short story. There's no reason to spend 5 pages describing the doorknobs and the way the light filters through a window. That just gets the meat of the story and tell people what is most urgent that you want them to hear, and then let the details sort of worry about themselves.
I think you could say that's probably true of Vonnegut too. Like, he was pretty. I mean, none of his books are huge tomes or anything like that.
Yeah, no, I think the writers I admire, that's kind of the one thing they have in common for the most part, is they don't spend a lot of time sort of gilding the lily. They don't spend a lot of time creating all these background details or describing the mise-en-scene. They're driven by something they need and have to say.
Do you have a favorite book from childhood?
In terms of children's books, I didn't read a lot of children's books. When I was a kid, I read mostly, the Bible or encyclopedias. I read a lot of adult or semi-adult novels. I remember I loved Lord of the Flies, William Golding's Lord of the Flies when I was a kid. Mostly I lived vicariously through the fantasy of washing up one day on a desert island with a bunch of other kids. Of course, didn't end up that well for them, but the fantasy persisted. I think I've always been just kind of liked books where people have a chance to create their own world, or they can do things over from scratch.
What do you think when you're looking at satire? What do you think makes good satire? Or I don't know if that's a good question or not, but what do you think differentiates good satire from kind of weak satire?
I think one mistake that goes into a lot of satire is that it's too angry. I think it needs to be leavened with a little bit of hope or affection for human beings who are making these mistakes. If it's just unrelentingly angry and bitter and caustic, it's just going to come across as whining. It's just going to come across as unpleasant to read. So I think that the secret to good satire is being brutally honest about what's wrong with people and what they're doing wrong, but at the same time kind of caring about those people and having the opportunity for redemption.
Yeah, because I guess at the end of the day, we're all part of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the key. It's that you shouldn't. I don't like writing about people who I consider to be the other. I like writing about people who I think are this is my Uncle Frank, or this is part of who I am, or this I can so relate to that, even though this character is completely unsympathetic. To me, that's what makes a character feel real, and I think that's what makes anything negative you have to say about them kind of hold, because it's not just creating this two-dimensional character so you can bash them. It's more no, this is a genuine opinion I have about not only the way those other people work, but the way that I work as well.
Well, I think that it really comes through in the character in your Flintstones work with Mr. Slate, as someone who is what could be just a two-dimensional evil person. But you have these moments where it's either he changes his mind a little bit or evolves, or just even seeing him vulnerable. I thought he was a really fascinating character in your work. Yeah,
I think Mr. Slate changes in the way that most of us change. That we have our opinions and we're blithe about it, and we don't really care about who they affect until it affects us personally, and then we begin to learn a little empathy. I didn't like that. Maybe this other person that I did that to didn't like it either. And you begin, and it's not instantaneously overnight you've had this revelation and you completely change. It's a gradual process. Every opinion is in the end the product of 1,000 lost arguments. It's you have to sort of have the weight of doubt gnawing at you for a long time before you make the decision to change your long held cherished notions.
Yeah, I think I'm glad I heard you say that, because I've heard so many people say, especially with today's dialogue and the way we talk about issues today, that we're only becoming more divided and more entrenched, and there is actually no way to possibly change people's minds. And I guess I don't know how much I buy that, because I've changed my mind over time. But
yeah, I don't agree with that at all, because I think their minds had to get to that point to begin with. So if their minds could have changed to have those opinions, why can't they be changed to have other opinions?
So do you still think that's possible even today? Like Twitter hasn't changed that for people, I guess. That's what I constantly hear is we can't have dialogue anymore because of, fill in the blank, Twitter or, Fox News and MSNBC or whatever,
Yeah, it's become hard because everybody's allowed to sort of live in their own sort of self-created bubble. But to me, that just makes the opportunities we have for dialogue, for engaging people who aren't in our bubble, all that more important. That when, we have the unpleasant opportunity to counter somebody who is like in a completely different world or is a completely different perspective, that we actually cherish and enhance these moments of interchange. Not that we shrink from them because their opinions are so foreign to ours. Part of it is just learning to be good listeners. That a lot of times in this culture, especially, we've gone away from like having the same news sources and same sources of information and just being kind of indoctrinated by people who already agree with us. That we don't really listen; we just kind of wait to talk. And I think the key is that for people on left and right, even though what somebody else might believe is reprehensible and should not be compromised with in any way, I think there's still value in listening to them, letting them know that you acknowledge them as a human being. And then, most people, regardless of how reprehensible their beliefs are, will have the human reaction of paying you the same respect and listening to what you say. And maybe not, it's not like you talk to a skinhead, and they're going to go home and change, throw away their posters of Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
But it begins that process. It
right.
begins that process of doubt beginning to gnaw on them, or at least making them aware that there are people outside their bubble who are decent and reasonable people who don't think the way they do.
Yeah, I think you're right, because it's like if your goal is just to win an argument, then I think that's where the entrenchment really starts to happen. And usually, if your goal is to win an argument, it's because you're not listening, or at least you're not really giving their ideas the weight that they themselves are giving them.
Right. And it's really kind of cheapening your own ideas, because it's just treating them like it's a game of Magic the Gathering, where it's, I've got this card and I've got that card. Which card am I going to play next? Whereas if you really care about your ideas, you care about them because they affect people's lives, because these matter. And you should talk about them that way. Like, this is really important because it affects people's lives. I'm not just waiting to make an argument. I want you to know how this is going to affect people. This is what I think will happen if we do what you're saying.
So I wanted to know, how do you stay informed?
Well, I'm lucky to be old enough not to have been just raised in the internet, so I still read a lot of printed material, which I think helps. I think it's really the only way to learn about issues in depth, just by reading books or investigative magazine articles. I think that the internet's really great at keeping you abreast of topical issues or headlines. Twitter is really great at keeping me up to date on what's happening right now or what just happened, around the world. But I think it's really important that people not just make that their entire information diet. They actually read books about the world, or old, more printed sources that go much more in depth than you can in 140 or 280 as it is now characters.
I don't get the impression after reading your work, even especially something like your other work you did with Prez, which is the comic you did about the teenage president, that you see a lot of value in a lot of this country or America's obsession with things like accumulating wealth or fame or power. So what does success look like to you?
Success can be all those things, but just realize they're means to an end. That the power is not an end into itself, neither is the wealth. It's what are you going to do with it? What are you going to create with that? And to me, success is ultimately creating something that will make the world better after you're gone. The idea that you just sort of accumulate this wealth and then that's the end of the credits roll, to me that just seems in-chote. That's not really meaningful. It's sort of like the people who just want to win an argument. It's like you just want to win in this game, but it doesn't really mean anything to you.
One of the things that we always ask every author that we interview as kind of our closing question is, what are you actually reading right now?
I'm reading Homo Deus by Yuval Harari, who wrote A Brief History of Humanity. But it's about how we are starting to take over our own evolution. We are starting to choose the paths that the human race will develop in the future. And it's a fascinating read.
Does he talk a lot about technology in that book?
Yeah, about how technology is changing human cognitive abilities it's no longer becoming this sort of externalized tool that we use to get information. It's becoming a part of the human fabric itself.
Wow. Pretty fascinating stuff. Always with the big topics, huh?
Yeah. No, that's what I find fascinating. The issues aren't small. They're big and galactic in nature.
I also wanted to ask just kind of what you're working on right now. I know you just released some of it was released, right? The Snagglepuss series that you're involved in now.
Yeah, we released an 8-page sampler, but issue number 1 comes out in January. And so, it's about Snagglepuss reimagined as a sort of gay Southern Gothic playwright living in 1950s New York.
That sounds incredible. I'm excited to read that. And now is that and that's for DC as well? Yeah, that's
part of DC's Hanna-Barbera line, and he runs afoul of the House on Un-American Activities Committee. So.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
I'm hoping it'll be good.
Yeah. Mark Russell, I just want to thank you so much once again for coming on the podcast and taking the time to talk about the Flintstones, and thank you for writing it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for reading it.
I hope you liked that conversation with Mark, and it piqued your interest enough to at least check out some of his comics. If you want to check out the Flintstones, Prez, or God is Disappointed in You, you can find them all by searching the catalog on our website. That's www.cooklib.org. Prez and the Flintstones are also available anytime through our Hoopla app. And I will admit, I was really skeptical about reading comics on my phone, but Hoopla has this feature in the app called Action View, where if you tap on an individual panel in the comic, it zooms in, and then as you swipe, it glides along each panel, making it this kind of cool, almost cinematic way to read comics. So give it a try. Just download the free app on your smartphone or tablet and start reading. Have you visited Shelf Life, the library's blog? That's where we here at Cook Library regularly post what we're reading, and you will also find some local history stories, all kinds of genealogy advice, and past episodes of this podcast. That blog can be found at shelflife.cooklib.org. If you like this podcast, please share it with others, tell everyone you know about it, and let them know that they can subscribe in Apple Podcasts or pretty much anywhere that they like to get their podcasts. And one of the best ways you can show your support is just by leaving us a nice rating over at Apple Podcasts. We would like to hear from you, so please send in any of your feedback, your comments, your suggestions, anytime. You can talk to us on Twitter at Cook Library or send us an email. The email address is webmaster@cooklib.org. We will be back soon, but until then, keep reading, keep watching, and keep listening.